The evening sun cast its last golden rays across the sprawling gardens of the estate, where tall trees lined the walkways and strings of fairy lights hung overhead like stars preparing to take their place in the night sky. It was the kind of setting that looked perfect in photographs, where wealth and power could be displayed in the most elegant way possible. The tables were decorated with white roses and crystal glasses, and the soft sound of violins floated in the background as guests in designer suits and glittering gowns took their seats. This was no ordinary evening. It was the grand gala of the Yao Harrington family, one of the oldest and wealthiest families in the city. For years their events had been the talk of society, a chance for the rich and powerful to mingle, to show off, and to reinforce who belonged to this world and who did not. Everyone who was anyone wanted an invitation. Among the guests moving about was a woman who did not stand out because of her dress or her jewelry, but because of her quiet confidence. Her name was Maya. She wore a simple green dress, elegant but not extravagant. She had not come to show off or to compete with the women dripping in diamonds. Maya was there because it was her work. She was the lead event planner, the one who had spent weeks arranging every detail, from the flowers on the tables to the timing of the fireworks planned for later in the night. Maya had always been the kind of person who worked quietly behind the scenes, making sure others had their perfect moments. She came from a hard-working family that had never known luxury. Her mother worked long hours as a nurse, her father had passed away years ago, and Maya had carried the responsibility of supporting her younger siblings from a young age. She had learned early that life did not hand her opportunities. She had to build them herself. Even though she was surrounded by people with fortunes that could buy anything, Maya never felt small. She stood with her back straight, her eyes focused, and her mind calm. For her, success was not about wealth, but about making something meaningful from nothing, and that was what made her presence so unique. While many in the crowd measured their worth in money, Maya's worth shone from within. The gala reached its peak when the Harrington heiress Isabella made her entrance. She wore a gown made of shimmering gold fabric that seemed to glow under the lights. Her hair was styled to perfection, and every step she took was designed to remind everyone that she was the star of the night. She held the arm of her fiancé, a handsome man who looked slightly uncomfortable in all the attention. Guests whispered about the couple, praising how perfect they looked together, how powerful their union would be for business and reputation. Isabella noticed Maya almost immediately. It was not that Maya was drawing attention to herself. She was quietly arranging flowers on a table near the dance floor, but Isabella's sharp eyes caught everything. To Isabella, who had grown up in privilege, Maya was invisible until her fiancé, with a polite smile, leaned toward Maya and thanked her for the evening's beautiful setup. It was an innocent moment. He said it with genuine appreciation, his voice soft and respectful, acknowledging the work behind the glamour. Maya smiled in return, her eyes lighting up with pride that her efforts were seen, even if only briefly. But to Isabella, that small exchange felt like a spark threatening to light a fire she had long feared, losing control of the attention around her. As the night moved forward, Isabella's eyes followed Maya. Every time her fiancé looked at the decorations, at the candles, or even at the plates of food served with precision, Isabella imagined his thoughts leading back to Maya. Her insecurities, hidden beneath layers of pride, began to surface. She saw Maya not as the planner, but as a rival, someone who did not belong in their circle yet dared to shine in her presence. Maya, however, was unaware of the storm brewing inside Isabella. She moved gracefully through the event, checking on the staff, ensuring the champagne glasses were refilled, adjusting small details that no one else noticed but which created perfection in the guest's experience. She was focused only on her work and on the satisfaction that came from seeing the night flow without flaws. The moment that changed everything came suddenly. Isabella approached her fiancé as he stood near the garden's edge, speaking with a group of guests. When she arrived, she noticed him once again exchange a brief word of thanks with Maya, who had passed by to check the placement of the dessert table. This time, Isabella's patience snapped. The music continued, but to Isabella it sounded like a roar in her ears. She walked directly toward Maya, her heels clicking sharply against the stone pathway, drawing the attention of those nearby. The guests turned their heads as the heiress raised her voice. "What do you think you are doing?" Isabella demanded, her tone sharp and accusing. Maya stopped, confused by the sudden hostility. "I am only making sure everything is perfect," she answered politely, keeping her composure even as people began to watch. Isabella's eyes narrowed. "Stay away from my fiancé," she shouted, her voice carrying across the garden. The words cut through the music, silencing the laughter and chatter of the crowd. Guests froze in shock. Maya blinked, stunned by the accusation. Her lips parted as if to explain, but before she could speak, Isabella raised her hand and struck her across the face. The sound of the slap echoed like thunder. Gasps filled the air. Maya staggered slightly but caught herself, her hand slowly lifting to her cheek where the sting burned. The world around her seemed to go silent. The only thing she could hear was the rush of her own heartbeat. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some turned their eyes away, unwilling to get involved. Others whispered in disbelief, shocked that the wealthy heiress had acted with such cruelty. A few even stared at Maya, waiting to see how she would respond. Maya did not cry. She did not shout back. She simply stood tall, her dignity holding her upright even as humiliation burned her skin. Her silence was not weakness, it was strength. By refusing to lower herself to Isabella's rage, Maya showed something no amount of money could buy: self-respect. Isabella, breathing heavily, expected Maya to crumble, to beg for understanding, or to walk away in shame. But when Maya lifted her head and met Isabella's gaze with calm eyes, the heiress felt something she had not expected: fear. For in that quiet strength, Isabella realized she could not break her. The guests around them held their breath. The slap was more than an act of jealousy. It was a moment that revealed character. And while Isabella had power in her wealth, Maya held power in her grace. The night was not over, but something had shifted. People looked at Maya differently now. She was no longer just the planner moving in the background. She had become the center of the story, not by choice, but by the way she carried herself through humiliation. And though Maya stood alone in that moment, she did not know that someone was watching closely, ready to step in, someone who would change the direction of this night forever. The garden gala, which only moments earlier had been full of laughter and music, now felt like a stage where time had stopped. Guests who had been clinking glasses and exchanging polite conversations sat frozen, their eyes locked on the scene that had just unfolded. The slap still echoed in their minds, heavy and unsettling. Maya stood silently, her cheek stinging, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit, but her back remained straight. She refused to let anyone see her break. The heiress, Isabella, still trembling from her outburst, stared at Maya with eyes that revealed a storm of emotions: jealousy, insecurity, and a desperate need to maintain control. She had expected Maya to crumble, to retreat in shame and embarrassment, but Maya's stillness unsettled her. Instead of collapsing under the weight of humiliation, Maya stood taller, her dignity more visible than ever. This frightened Isabella, because she knew the eyes of the guests were no longer admiring her golden dress or her position in society. They were questioning her cruelty. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a quiet wind stirring the leaves. Some guests leaned toward one another, shocked by Isabella's behavior. Others shook their heads in disapproval, while a few avoided eye contact, pretending not to have seen what had just happened. It was easier for them to act as though the ugliness of the moment did not exist, than to face the truth that privilege had turned poisonous right before their eyes. Maya pressed her lips together, fighting the heat that threatened to rise in her throat. She was human, and she felt the sting not only of the slap but of the humiliation that came with it. Yet she reminded herself that losing control would only give Isabella what she wanted: a scene that would confirm her twisted sense of superiority. Instead, Maya chose silence, the kind of silence that carries more weight than 1,000 angry words. That silence only deepened Isabella's rage. "Do you think you are above me? Do you think you can walk in here with your cheap dress and your fake smile and steal what is mine?" Isabella's voice shook as she shouted, But it was not Maya who looked small in that moment. It was Isabella, her words dripping with desperation, her insecurity exposed for all to see. Maya's eyes did not flinch. She had endured far worse in her life than the tantrum of a spoiled heiress. She had known hunger, sleepless nights, and the heavy responsibility of raising her siblings when her mother was too exhausted from double shifts. She had built her life on resilience. Compared to those battles, Isabella's slap was nothing more than noise. The fiancé, caught in the middle, stepped forward uncertainly, his face pale. "Isabella, please," he whispered, reaching for her arm. But she pulled away, unwilling to be calmed. To her, admitting she was wrong was more unbearable than making a public scene. Her fear of losing face was stronger than her sense of right and wrong. The other guests now looked at Maya with new eyes. She was no longer invisible, no longer just the planner blending into the background. She was a woman who stood with grace in the face of cruelty, and that strength was impossible to ignore. Some admired her silently. Others wondered how they would have reacted in her place. But no one could deny the truth. In that moment, Maya's presence was greater than Isabella's wealth. Maya finally spoke, her voice calm and measured, though it trembled slightly from the weight of holding back her pain. "I did not come here to take anything from you," she said. "I came here to do my work, to make this night perfect for you and your family. I did not deserve this." The words were simple, but they cut through the night like a blade. Isabella opened her mouth to respond, but found nothing to say. The truth had exposed her, and no amount of shouting could erase it. For a brief second, there was silence again. Guests waited, unsure what would happen next. Some expected Maya to leave, to walk away and end the confrontation. But Maya did not move. She held her ground, proving that her dignity was not something anyone could take from her. Isabella, however, was not ready to surrender. "You are lying," she spat, though her voice cracked. "I saw the way he looked at you. Do not pretend you are innocent." Her hand shook as she pointed toward her fiancé, her eyes darting desperately between him and Maya. But the crowd had already stopped believing her. They had seen enough to know who was at fault. Maya did not respond to the accusation. She knew that some battles were not worth fighting with words. She had already won by refusing to sink to Isabella's level. Instead, she looked at the faces around her, at the people who were witnessing this moment. Some looked away, guilty for not stepping in. Others looked at her with sympathy. And then there were those whose eyes were sharp with respect, as though they had discovered something rare in her composure. The slap had been meant to humiliate her, but instead, it revealed her strength. The accusations had been meant to destroy her, but instead, they showed Isabella's weakness. Maya had turned pain into power, and the crowd could see it. As Isabella struggled to maintain control, Maya felt something shift deep inside her. She had always been quiet, always the one to carry her burden silently, but tonight had forced her into the center of attention. For the first time, she realized that her strength was not just for herself or her family. It was something others could see, something that could inspire. But Maya was not alone. Though she did not yet notice, someone had been watching the entire scene unfold from a distance. A tall man in a dark suit stood among the guests, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on his sister. Adrian Cole had arrived at the gala quietly, not wanting to draw attention to himself. Many of the guests did not recognize him, though his name was known across the country. He was a billionaire entrepreneur, a man who had built an empire from nothing. But to Maya, he was not the billionaire the world admired. He was simply her older brother, the one who had once promised their mother that he would protect her no matter what. As he watched Isabella's hand strike Maya and saw his sister's quiet strength in the aftermath, Adrian felt a familiar fire rise inside him. He knew that Maya would never ask for help, that she would endure cruelty in silence if it meant keeping her dignity. But he also knew this was the moment to step in, not just as her brother, but as someone who would not allow anyone to tear her down again. The crowd did not know it yet, but the gala was about to shift once more. If the slap had revealed Maya's strength, the next moment would reveal a brother's love and the kind of power that no wealth could rival. The garden was filled with a heavy silence that no music could hide. The violin players had stopped without being told. The guests held their breath, and even the flickering candle flames seemed to hesitate in the night air. Maya stood at the center of it all, her cheek burning but her spirit unbroken. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, some pitying, some admiring, and some ashamed because they had chosen silence when cruelty had been carried out in front of them. But Maya was not thinking of them. She was thinking of her younger days, of the times when life had slapped her harder than Isabella ever could, and how she had survived every moment. Isabella, however, was unraveling. Her golden gown, her flawless hair, her practiced smile, none of it mattered now. Her voice trembled as she tried to defend herself, but it was clear that she had lost the crowd. Her fiancé stood beside her, torn between loyalty and the weight of truth, his face flushed with embarrassment. He had not expected his bride-to-be to create such a storm in public, and the more he looked at Maya's calm face, the more ashamed he felt of Isabella's actions. Maya inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the moment. Her silence had become a shield. The slap, though painful, was nothing compared to the strength she felt rising within her. She was no stranger to humiliation. She had faced whispers behind her back when she wore second-hand clothes in school. She had endured sneers when she worked extra jobs instead of attending parties. And she had carried the responsibility of raising siblings when others her age lived carefree lives. Every struggle had shaped her into the woman she was now. This night, this slap, was only another test, and she would not let it define her. The silence stretched so long that it became unbearable for some. Guests shifted in their seats, clearing their throats, whispering quietly to one another. They all knew something more was about to happen. It felt as though the night had paused, waiting for the next move, the next word, the next force strong enough to break the tension. That force came from a figure who stepped forward at last. Adrian Cole moved through the crowd with a quiet authority that commanded attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had faced both poverty and fortune, and survived both. Many of the guests did not recognize him immediately, but those who did gasped softly, their eyes widening. His reputation was legendary, though he himself was humble about it. He had risen from nothing, worked through endless obstacles, and built an empire respected worldwide. Yet tonight he was not the billionaire entrepreneur. He was simply a brother. Maya saw him approach, and for the first time that night her composure wavered, not because she was ashamed, but because she knew her brother had witnessed her humiliation. She had never wanted him to see her like this, standing in front of people who looked at her as if she did not belong. Adrian's eyes met hers, and she saw not pity, not anger, but something stronger, a steady fire that promised protection and justice. The crowd parted slightly, giving Adrian space as he walked toward Maya. Every step was measured, calm, but filled with weight. Isabella froze when she realized who he was. She had seen his face before, on magazine covers, in business journals, and on television interviews. But she had never expected to face him in person, especially under such circumstances. Her hand, the one that had struck Maya, trembled slightly at her side. When Adrian reached his sister, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. It was not just an act of comfort. It was a reminder that she was not alone, that her strength was shared. Maya closed her eyes briefly, drawing strength from his presence. The sting on her cheek began to fade in importance. Adrian then turned to the crowd. His voice was calm but carried across the garden with clarity that silenced even the whispers. "I saw what happened here tonight," he said slowly. "I saw a woman of grace and dignity treated with cruelty in front of all of you." His eyes swept across the faces, meeting the gaze of those who had turned away, of those who had whispered instead of acting. They lowered their eyes, ashamed. Then he looked directly at Isabella. His tone did not rise, but the weight of his words was undeniable. "You think you struck her down, but you did not. You only revealed who you are. And in doing so you revealed who she is." He gestured lightly toward Maya, who stood silently beside him. "My sister is more than the role she plays at this event. She is more than the work she does. She is strength, she is sacrifice, she is dignity, and tonight you tried to take that from her. You failed." The words fell like stones into the silence, rippling through the crowd. Isabella's face flushed red, her lips trembling as if she wanted to argue, but no sound came. Her fiancé looked at her, disappointment clear in his eyes. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that love could not survive where respect was absent. Maya's heart swelled with emotion. She had not needed anyone to defend her, but hearing her brother's voice echo her truth filled her with gratitude. Adrian's presence did not erase the slap, but it transformed the moment. What had begun as humiliation was now turning into something else, something powerful, something unforgettable. The guests began to murmur again, but this time the tone was different. Their eyes no longer lingered on Maya with judgment. Instead, there was admiration, respect, even shame at their earlier silence. A few nodded toward Adrian, acknowledging his courage to speak when others had stayed quiet. Isabella, cornered by truth, tried one last attempt to regain control. "You do not understand," she stammered. She was trying to, but Adrian cut her off, his voice still calm but sharper now. "Enough. What I understand is this: no matter how much wealth you inherit, it cannot buy respect. And no matter how much you try to tear someone down, it cannot diminish the light of those who rise above." The finality in his words silenced her completely. She turned her face away, unable to meet the eyes of those who now looked at her not with envy but with disdain. Her power in the room had vanished. Maya stood beside her brother, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from the overwhelming realization of what had just taken place. She had come to the gala to work, to serve quietly, but fate had pushed her into the center of the stage. And in that spotlight, she had discovered something she had always carried but had never fully recognized. Her dignity was unshakable, her strength undeniable. Adrian leaned toward her, his voice softer now, meant only for her ears. "You did not need me to stand for you. You had already won by the way you carried yourself. But I will always be here." Maya's eyes filled with tears, but they did not fall. She nodded, understanding that this moment was bigger than both of them. It was a reminder to everyone watching that true power does not come from wealth or titles, but from character. From the courage to endure and the grace to rise. The gala, once meant to display glitter and glamour, had become something else entirely. It had become a stage for truth, for dignity, for a lesson that no guest would forget. And though the night would continue, though music would resume and glasses would clink again, the story of the slap and the silence after would echo far beyond the garden walls. It would be told and retold, not as a tale of scandal, but as a lesson of strength. For Maya, it was not the end of humiliation, but the beginning of transformation. For Isabella, it was not the end of her pride, but the unveiling of her weakness. And for Adrian, it was the fulfillment of a promise, to protect his sister not with fists or fury, but with truth and unwavering love. The garden had never felt so quiet. For a moment, it was as though the stars themselves leaned closer to listen, and the flowers that lined the archways held their blooms still. Adrian's words had done more than silence Isabella. They had pierced the shallow glamour of the evening and reminded everyone that beneath all the wealth, gowns, and champagne, there were still truths too powerful to be ignored. The guests sat in their seats, trying to process what they had just witnessed, their eyes shifting between Maya's calm figure and Adrian's steady presence. Maya stood beside her brother, her breathing still uneven, her chest rising and falling as she tried to stay composed. She had never liked attention. For her, life had always been about staying behind the curtain, doing her work quietly and letting others shine. But tonight she could not hide. She had been forced into the center, and she had faced humiliation that would have broken many. Yet now, because of Adrian's words, the shame that Isabella had tried to put on her shoulders seemed to lift. It was as though her brother's voice had taken that weight and turned it into something else. A shield, a crown, a light that refused to dim. The guests' whispers grew louder, but this time they were not filled with mockery. They carried tones of awe and respect. A woman in a diamond necklace leaned toward her husband and whispered. She did not even raise her voice. She carried herself better than most of us would have. Another guest, a man in a tailored tuxedo, nodded thoughtfully. It takes strength to stand in silence when you are being attacked. That strength is rarer than money. Isabella, on the other hand, stood trembling. Her cheeks burned not from shame she admitted to herself, but from the shame others now saw in her. Her fiancé had stepped back slightly, his expression unreadable, his faith in her visibly shaken. For the first time, Isabella realized that the crowd she always wanted to control now looked at her with disgust. She had thought her wealth and beauty gave her the right to do anything without consequence. But the truth was clear. Wealth could silence some, but it could never silence dignity when it stood firm. Adrian's presence grew larger in that silence. He was not shouting, he was not threatening, but his calm strength made every person feel as though they were in the presence of something greater. He glanced once more at Isabella, and though his expression was not cruel, it carried a weight she could not ignore. "Respect," he said softly but firmly, "is not given to those who demand it. It is earned by how we treat others. Tonight you showed us all what you value, and tonight my sister showed us all what true respect looks like." Those words shifted the air in the garden. The guests straightened in their chairs as though they had been personally challenged. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed of the times they too had turned away from injustice. Others looked at Maya with admiration that felt genuine, no longer filtered through the lens of her role as an event planner, but through the truth of her strength as a person. Maya's hands trembled slightly at her sides, but she did not speak. She knew Adrian's words were not just for Isabella. They were for everyone who had ever doubted her, for every person who had judged her by her position or her skin, for every whispered insult she had ignored over the years. His voice gave sound to the dignity she had carried in silence. The violinists, unsure of what to do, lowered their instruments. The staff, who had been frozen in the background, exchanged glances. They had always admired Maya in private, respecting her work ethic, her kindness, the way she treated them as equals. But now, seeing her stand so tall in front of the wealthy elite, their pride in her deepened. She was one of them in heart, even if she stood in a different place in the world. Isabella tried again to find her footing. You do not understand what this looks like," she muttered, her voice weak but still stubborn. Adrian shook his head slowly, his eyes locking on hers with a calm that felt heavier than anger. "I understand enough. I understand that you struck someone who had done nothing to you. I understand that you let jealousy blind you. And I understand that you tried to humiliate a woman whose strength is greater than your cruelty. That is all anyone here needs to understand." The words left Isabella cornered. Her fiancé looked at her with disappointment so clear that it made her throat tighten. She wanted to scream, to cry, to insist she had been right, but deep down she knew the truth. She had revealed the smallest parts of herself, while Maya had revealed the strongest. And the crowd, once so eager to celebrate her, now saw her as fragile glass, sharp but easily shattered. Adrian turned back to Maya, softening his expression. For a moment, the noise of the crowd disappeared, and it was just the two of them. "You held your ground," he said quietly, his voice meant for her alone. "That is something no one can ever take from you. You stood taller than everyone else here tonight." Maya swallowed hard, her eyes moist but shining. She whispered back, "I did not want this. I just wanted to do my work." Adrian nodded. "I know. But sometimes the moments we do not choose are the ones that show the world who we truly are." The crowd began to applaud softly, unsure at first, but then stronger as more joined in. It was not applause for the event, not applause for Isabella, but applause for Maya, for her dignity, her silence, her refusal to break. The sound filled the garden, and for the first time that evening, Maya felt seen in a way she never had before. The applause washed over Isabella like a cold wave. She had been humiliated in the very place she thought she was untouchable. Her fiancé stepped away from her, not in anger but in quiet realization that he no longer recognized the woman beside him. And the guests, the very people whose admiration she craved, now admired someone else, a woman she had tried to belittle. Maya stood still, humbled by the applause but not carried away by it. She knew that life was not about crowds or clapping. Tomorrow she would return to her ordinary life, to her responsibilities, to the quiet strength that had always guided her. But tonight she had been shown something she would never forget. That dignity could shine brighter than gold, and that even when struck down she could rise taller than before. The applause faded, replaced by the soft rustle of the night air. Maya exhaled slowly, her heart steady again. Adrian remained beside her, a silent pillar of strength. The gala continued, but the night had changed forever. Every guest who left that evening carried the memory of what they had witnessed. Some would tell the story as a scandal, but most would tell it as a lesson. They would remember the heiress who revealed her weakness through cruelty, and they would remember the woman who revealed her strength through silence. And above all, they would remember the voice that changed everything, a brother's voice, calm and firm, reminding them all that true respect cannot be bought, only earned. The night pressed on, but nothing about it felt the same. The laughter that had once rolled through the garden had vanished, replaced by a heavy awareness that something unforgettable had happened. The slap had been quick, a single moment of cruelty, but the aftermath lingered in every corner of the gala. People whispered in low tones, their eyes darting toward Maya and Adrian, their admiration now clear. Even those who had earlier turned away afraid to get involved now carried a look of quiet regret. Maya, standing beside her brother, could feel the shift in the air. She was not used to attention. For years she had been the quiet one, the woman who carried heavy loads silently, the planner who worked behind the curtains while others danced in the light. But tonight her silence had spoken louder than any performance. She had been struck, humiliated, and exposed, yet she had stood tall. And now, her brother's words wrapped around her like armor, turning her pain into a story of dignity. Adrian looked at the guests, his steady gaze moving from one face to the next. He did not speak immediately. He let the silence build again, heavy and uncomfortable, so that when he finally opened his mouth, his words would land like stones in still water. His voice was deep, calm, and deliberate, every syllable carrying weight. "There are moments," he began, "when silence becomes more powerful than 1,000 shouts. My sister has shown you that tonight. She was struck, accused, and humiliated, yet she chose not to fight back with cruelty. She chose dignity." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the garden. No one dared interrupt him. "Do you know what real strength is? It is not in the diamonds on your neck, not in the gold in your bank, not in the titles you carry on your invitations. Real strength is in restraint. It is in the ability to remain standing when the world tries to push you down. That is what my sister showed you tonight." Maya's throat tightened as she listened. She had lived her life believing that her strength was invisible, known only to herself and those closest to her. To hear it spoken out loud in front of people who had always looked past her felt overwhelming. She lowered her eyes, not out of shame but out of humility, while Adrian's words lifted her higher than she had ever allowed herself to stand. The guests leaned closer, as if afraid to miss a word. Even the staff paused in their work, their trays balanced in their hands, their eyes wide with admiration. Adrian's words were not just for Isabella. They were for everyone who had ever measured worth by the wrong scales. He turned then to Isabella, whose golden gown no longer glowed under the lights but seemed to weigh her down. She had shrunk in her own shadow, her hands trembling at her sides, her eyes darting nervously toward her fiancé, who stood apart from her, ashamed. Adrian's voice remained calm, but the sharpness in his tone cut through the air. "You thought a slap would make her smaller. You thought your words would shame her, but all you have done is reveal yourself. You showed your fear, your insecurity, and your weakness. And in that same moment she revealed her strength." Isabella's lips parted, but she could not speak. Every excuse she had rehearsed in her mind suddenly sounded hollow. The crowd no longer believed her. She was the heiress with everything money could buy, yet she had been exposed as fragile. Maya, the woman she had tried to humiliate, now stood taller without even trying. Adrian did not stop there. He let his words grow deeper, more piercing. "Respect is not something you can demand. Respect is not something you can buy. Respect is earned by how you treat people when no one is watching, and especially when everyone is. Tonight you failed that test." The crowd stirred. Heads nodded, lips whispered agreement, and some even clapped softly. The truth in Adrian's words resonated with everyone, not just because they had seen the slap, but because deep down, they knew how often they too had measured people by wealth, by appearances, by the shallow glitter of status. His words were not just judgment. They were a mirror, forcing them all to reflect on themselves. Maya shifted slightly, her hands still trembling, but she felt stronger with every word her brother spoke. She remembered her childhood, when Adrian had told her stories at night about how the world could be cruel, but how they would always rise above it. She remembered his promise that he would protect her, not by fighting her battles for her, but by standing with her when the battles came. Tonight, he had fulfilled that promise in front of the entire world she had once thought would never see her. The fiancé finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Isabella," he said, this is not the woman I thought I was with." His words landed harder on Isabella than Adrian's did, because they came from the one person she thought she owned with her beauty and wealth. His disappointment made her chest tighten and she turned away, her eyes brimming with tears she refused to shed in front of everyone. Adrian did not gloat. His voice softened as he turned once more to the crowd. "Let this night remind us all of something. Money will fade, beauty will fade, status will fade, but dignity, respect, and strength of character will outlast them all." My sister did not come here to be noticed. She came here to do her work. And yet, in the moment she was struck down, she rose higher than any of us tonight. The applause began again, stronger now, no longer hesitant. Guests clapped not just for Maya, but for the truth of those words. The sound filled the garden like a wave, rising and falling, carrying with it the acknowledgement that they had witnessed something rare. Maya pressed her lips together, holding back tears. She had never wanted to be the center of attention, but tonight she understood that sometimes the world chooses your moment for you. She felt Adrian's hand steady on her shoulder, and for the first time she allowed herself to smile faintly. Not for the applause, not for the crowd, but for the truth that had been spoken into the air, truth that validated every quiet sacrifice she had ever made. Isabella slipped quietly into the background, her golden dress no longer a beacon, but a reminder of her downfall. She was not forgotten, but she was no longer admired. Her name, once carried with pride, would now be whispered with pity. The gala went on, but the night belonged to Maya now. Not because she had sought it, but because she had earned it in the hardest way. The guests danced again. The music played, the champagne flowed, but every conversation circled back to what they had seen. They spoke of the slap, the silence, and the words of power that had transformed everything. When the night finally drew to a close, Maya walked through the garden with Adrian at her side. The fairy lights still glowed above them, but they no longer felt like decorations. They felt like stars bowing to her resilience. She exhaled slowly, the weight of the night settling into her bones. But alongside it was a new strength she had not felt before. Her brother looked down at her with quiet pride. "You know, Maya," he said softly, "you did not just endure tonight. You taught them. You showed them what strength looks like, and I think you reminded them what respect really means." Maya nodded, her eyes lifting toward the night sky. She did not need the applause, the whispers, or even the admiration. All she needed was the knowledge that she had faced cruelty without losing herself. That to her was the greatest victory of all. The garden was still lit with sparkling lights, but their glow felt different now. Earlier they had seemed like jewels meant to highlight Isabella's night. But now they seemed to shine for Maya. She had not wanted this attention, yet it had found her, and what began as humiliation had transformed into something else entirely. The guests no longer looked at her as a background figure. Their eyes carried a quiet respect. One she had earned not through wealth or status, but through the way she carried herself when everything was against her. Maya walked slowly across the lawn, Adrian beside her. She could feel the weight of stares following her, but instead of making her shrink, they lifted her. It was as though people finally saw her not as the planner, not as the worker behind the scenes, but as a woman who stood tall. She remembered the sting of Isabella's hand, but strangely it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a mark of strength. A line drawn between who she had been before tonight and who she was now. Isabella stood alone near the fountain, her once perfect figure trembling in the shadows of her golden dress. Her fiancé had moved away from her, speaking quietly with guests who now avoided her presence. She wanted to scream that they had all misunderstood, that she had only been protecting what was hers. But deep down she knew the truth. Her actions had not protected her. They had destroyed her. For the first time she felt what it was like to be on the outside, to have the crowd's eyes turn cold instead of adoring. Maya noticed her but did not gloat. She did not carry bitterness in her heart. Instead she felt a strange mixture of sadness and pity. She could see the cracks in Isabella's pride, the loneliness behind her cruelty. Maya understood something that Isabella did not. When you build your worth only on how others see you, you will always live in fear of losing it. Maya had built her worth on something stronger, her character, her resilience, her sacrifices, and that could never be taken from her. Adrian sensed his sister's thoughts and spoke softly. "Do not waste your heart on her," he said. "She has her own lessons to learn. You cannot carry that burden for her." Maya nodded. She knew he was right. Her strength tonight was not about revenge. It was about proving, to herself and to everyone watching, that she could rise above cruelty without letting it poison her. That was the true victory. The guests began to approach her one by one. A woman in a silver gown placed her hand on Maya's arm and said, "You showed us grace tonight. I do not think I could have stood as you did." A man in a dark suit added, "You reminded me of something I had forgotten, that dignity is more powerful than wealth." Their words humbled Maya, but she smiled politely, thanking them without letting pride take over. She knew the admiration was not what mattered. What mattered was that her silence and her strength had changed something inside the people who had witnessed it. Even the staff, who had always admired her from afar, looked at her with brighter eyes. A young waiter whispered as she passed, "You made us proud." Those words meant more to Maya than the applause of the wealthy. She had always seen herself in them, ordinary people who worked hard in the background, rarely noticed, rarely praised. Tonight she had shown them that their worth was not invisible. Isabella finally tried to step forward, her voice cracking as she said, "You are all making a mistake. She does not belong here. But her words fell flat. No one believed her anymore. The power in her voice had vanished, stripped away by her own cruelty. The guests turned away, uninterested in her excuses. Her fiancé gave her a long, disappointed look and then quietly walked out of the garden, leaving her behind. That more than anything crushed Isabella. She had tried to destroy Maya, but in the process she had destroyed herself. Maya did not smile at Isabella's downfall. Instead, she lifted her head higher, reminding herself that her story was not about proving others wrong but about living her truth. She walked toward the center of the garden where the music had begun again, not loud but soft and steady. The guests followed her with their eyes, as though she had become the center of the evening without even asking for it. Adrian raised his glass, not for a toast in the traditional sense but as a final word to the crowd. "Tonight you witnessed what true strength looks like," he said simply. "It was not in my words but in hers. Remember that dignity is greater than pride, and respect is greater than wealth." His voice carried gently through the air, and the guests lifted their glasses in quiet agreement. Maya's heart swelled. She had never needed validation from anyone, but to see respect in their eyes felt like a gift. For years she had worked silently, unseen, believing that dignity was something private, something known only to oneself. But tonight had taught her that dignity, when tested, could shine so bright that others could not ignore it. She felt a strength inside her that would never leave, a strength she could carry into every corner of her life. The gala ended hours later, but no one left the same as they had arrived. Guests who had come for glamour went home with a lesson they would not forget. They would tell the story in their homes, in their circles, perhaps even in the papers. Some would call it a scandal, but most would call it a lesson in respect. And at the center of that story was Maya, the woman who had been struck yet stood taller than all. As the last of the guests departed, Maya and Adrian walked together under the soft glow of the fading lights. The night air was cool, carrying with it the scent of roses and the memory of everything that had happened. Adrian looked at her and smiled. "You know, Maya," he said, "tonight they saw what I have always known about you. You are stronger than you realize." Maya smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "I only did what I had to do." "No," Adrian said firmly. "You did what few could do. You held your ground with dignity when it would have been easier to collapse. That is rare, and it is powerful." Maya looked up at the stars, their steady light reminding her of all the nights she had spent dreaming of a better life, of all the sacrifices she had made to carry her family forward. Tonight had been painful, but it had also been a turning point. She knew she would never see herself the same way again. She had proven not just to the world but to herself that she was unshakable. Respect had been restored, not just from others but within her own heart. And that, she knew, was the kind of respect no one could ever take away. When the last guests left the grand garden and the lights were slowly dimmed, the night carried with it a weight that would not fade easily. The gala had begun as a celebration of wealth and prestige, but it had ended as something much deeper. Those who had come for food, music, and glamour walked away with a story engraved in their minds, one that would be spoken about far longer than the fireworks or the menu. They had seen pride collapse and dignity stand tall. They had seen money lose its shine while character glowed brighter than diamonds. Maya lingered for a while, her feet moving softly across the garden floor where petals had fallen from the centerpieces and where laughter had once echoed. Now the silence felt peaceful, as if the garden itself was acknowledging her victory. Adrian walked beside her, his tall figure a reminder that she was not alone. But Maya knew that much of what had happened tonight had been her own fight. She had stood in the storm and she had not fallen. That truth filled her with quiet strength. The staff who had worked under her guidance came forward as the guests left. They smiled at her with genuine admiration. No longer just employees following instructions, but people who had witnessed someone they respected prove herself in front of the powerful. A young woman who had been serving wine whispered shyly, "You gave us courage tonight." "Thank you." Another nodded, adding, "People like us are rarely noticed, but you showed them our worth is real." Their words touched Maya more than any applause from the wealthy ever could. Adrian noticed how Maya's eyes softened at those words. He knew his sister had never wanted attention for herself, but she had always wanted to make life better for those who worked hard and remained unseen. Tonight she had done exactly that, not by planning an event, but by becoming the symbol of what it meant to stand tall in the face of injustice. News of the incident spread quickly. In the days that followed, the slap at the gala became the talk of the city. Some newspapers tried to soften the story, but most carried it as it was. A public act of cruelty from an heiress, met with grace and dignity from a woman she had tried to humiliate. People discussed it at coffee shops, in offices, in homes. They did not just gossip, they debated. What does true strength look like? What does respect really mean? Again and again the answer returned to Maya. For Maya, life went back to its rhythm. She rose early the next morning, prepared breakfast for her siblings, and managed her work with the same discipline she always had. But something had changed. People looked at her differently now. When she walked into meetings, there was an air of respect that had not been there before. Clients who had once overlooked her now leaned in to listen. Workers who had once seen her only as a boss now saw her as an inspiration. She had not sought it, but she had earned it. Isabella's life, on the other hand, shifted in the opposite direction. She avoided public appearances, embarrassed by the whispers that followed her wherever she went. Her fiancé ended their engagement quietly, not out of cruelty, but because he could not build a future with someone who had revealed such bitterness. The same friends who had once adored her now kept their distance. For the first time, Isabella was forced to face herself without the shield of admiration, and it was a mirror she did not like. Yet even as Isabella faded, Maya did not think of her with hatred. She thought of her with compassion. She knew that insecurity could make people cruel. And though Isabella had hurt her, Maya hoped she would one day learn that true worth comes not from what you own, but from how you treat others. Maya did not carry bitterness. She carried growth. That was her triumph. Adrian remained close to his sister in the days after the gala, proud of how she carried herself. He told her often, "You showed them a kind of wealth they will never forget, the wealth of dignity." Maya would smile softly, brushing his words aside, but deep down she knew he was right. She had discovered something inside herself that could never be shaken again. Weeks later, when another event was held in the city, Maya was invited not as a planner, but as a guest. She wore a simple dress, nothing extravagant, but when she entered the hall, people turned to look. This time their eyes did not dismiss her. They recognized her. They remembered the night she had stood tall while being struck down. They remembered the words her brother had spoken that cut through every shallow idea of respect. And when she moved through the crowd, she did not need to introduce herself. Her dignity walked ahead of her. The lesson of that night did not end with the gala. It echoed in conversations, in choices, in the way people treated those they had once overlooked. Some of the wealthy began to realize that the way they treated their staff mattered. Some ordinary workers began to walk a little taller, reminded that their worth was not defined by their job titles. Even the younger generation heard the story. Parents telling their children about the woman who had not raised her hand or her voice, but had won with silence and grace. Maya carried on with her life, but she carried it differently. The sting of the slap was long gone, but its memory was not bitter. It was a reminder that moments of cruelty can be turned into moments of transformation, if you choose not to let them break you. And she had chosen strength, chosen grace, chosen dignity. Adrian continued to support her, but he reminded her often that she had done it on her own. "I stood with you," he told her, "but you stood first. Remember that?" And Maya did. She knew now that no matter what life brought her way, she had within her a power no one could take. As time went on, the gala faded from the headlines, replaced by other stories, other scandals. But for those who had been there, and for those who had heard the story told, it was never forgotten. They remembered the heiress who lost everything because of her pride, and they remembered the woman who gained respect because of her dignity. More importantly, they remembered the lesson that true power does not come from wealth or titles but from the courage to endure cruelty without losing yourself. For Maya, it was never about fame or recognition. It was about living her truth. And that truth, once tested in the harshest of ways, had proven unbreakable. She was no longer just the woman who planned events, no longer just the sister Adrian protected. She was Maya, the woman who stood tall when the world tried to strike her down, the woman who turned silence into strength, the woman who showed everyone that respect, once earned, could never be taken away. And so the story lived on, not as a scandal but as an inspiration. A story whispered in homes, told in schools, shared in conversations late at night. A story of how one night of cruelty became a lifelong lesson in dignity. A story of how a single slap could not break a woman, but instead revealed the unshakable truth of who she was.